Donald Trump's presidency is set to redefine America's foreign policy. One of his key promises has been to end the war in Ukraine, a move that has coincided with an apparent rapprochement with Russia. Washington's strategy appears to be aimed at distancing Moscow from Beijing, as the United States increasingly views China as its primary global rival. In this analysis, we will examine whether Trump's strategy to separate Russia from China is feasible and what obstacles he may face in this endeavor. The relationship between Russia and China has historically been complex. During the era of the Russian Empire, the two nations were competitors in the region, with Russia forcing China into a series of unequal treaties to gain control over strategic territories. In the 20th century, the Soviet Union and China initially aligned after the communist takeover in China. However, ideological and geopolitical differences soon led to a major split. The Soviet Union's support for Mongolia's independence, as well as ideological disputes over the direction of communism, caused tensions. By the late 1950s and early 1960s, relations deteriorated further under Nikita Khrushchev, culminating in border skirmishes in the late 1960s. Despite this historical rivalry, relations between Moscow and Beijing improved following the Soviet collapse, and the two nations have grown increasingly close in the 21st century, especially as Western sanctions have pushed Russia further into China's economic orbit. The strategic importance of China to the U.S. The United States sees China as its main global competitor. China is the only nation with the economic and military capacity to challenge American dominance. In recent years, China has significantly increased its military spending, ranking second only to the United States in defense expenditures. China's ambitions in the Indo-Pacific, particularly regarding Taiwan, have been a key concern for Washington. The U.S. has sought to counter Beijing's growing influence through military alliances and economic policies. Trump's administration aims to weaken China's position by attempting to create a wedge between Beijing and Moscow, echoing a strategy used during the Cold War. Trump's reverse Nixon strategy. Trump's approach has been likened to a reverse Nixon or reverse Kissinger strategy. In the early 1970s, the U.S. capitalized on tensions between the Soviet Union and China to establish diplomatic relations with Beijing, thereby isolating Moscow. This maneuver significantly weakened the Soviet Union's geopolitical standing and contributed to its eventual collapse. Today, Trump appears to be attempting the opposite, improving relations with Russia to weaken China's global position. By reducing U.S. hostility toward Moscow, Trump hopes to incentivize Russia to distance itself from China. Despite Trump's intentions, several key factors make this strategy difficult to implement. Economic dependence. Russia has become increasingly reliant on China for trade, investment, and technology. Western sanctions have pushed Moscow closer to Beijing, making economic decoupling unlikely. Strategic alignment. Russia and China share common interests in countering Western influence and reshaping the global order to reflect a multipolar world. Historical lessons. Unlike the Cold War era, when ideological differences separated the USSR and China, today's Russia-China partnership is based on mutual benefit rather than ideological alignment. Trust issues with the West. Russia's leadership remains deeply suspicious of the United States and its allies, making any rapprochement with Washington difficult to sustain. One of the primary ways the United States could attempt to weaken Russia's ties with China is by lifting sanctions. If Russia were reintegrated into Western markets, it could reduce its dependence on China, particularly in energy exports. Restoring access to European energy markets would provide Russia with economic alternatives, potentially loosening its reliance on Beijing. However, lifting sanctions carries significant risks. It would send a message to other nations, including China, that aggression can eventually be forgiven without serious consequences. This could embolden China to take military action, such as an invasion of Taiwan. For this reason, a complete removal of sanctions is unlikely. Another potential lever is the resolution of the war in Ukraine. The United States could pressure Ukraine into making concessions to Russia, in exchange for reducing Russia's dependence on China. However, there are limits to this approach. If the US forces Ukraine into unfavorable terms, it would undermine trust among its allies, who may begin seeking alternative security arrangements. Additionally, completely conceding to Russia would validate its aggression, setting a dangerous precedent. Increasing economic pressure on Russia through tougher sanctions may not be effective, as it could further push Russia into China's economic sphere. Similarly, ramping up military aid to Ukraine might provoke China into providing greater support to Russia, deepening their strategic partnership. The longer the war continues, the more reliant Russia becomes on China, strengthening Beijing's influence. Today, China and, to some extent, India hold the most economic influence over Russia. The United States has limited ability to directly sway Russian leadership. Moreover, Russia recognizes that US foreign policy could shift with future elections. Unlike democratic transitions in Washington, Russian and Chinese leaderships operate under long-term, authoritarian rule, which makes long-lasting agreements with the US less reliable from Moscow's perspective. Some have compared this situation to President Nixon's rapprochement with China in the 20th century. However, that strategy worked because US-Soviet relations were at rock bottom, while China was looking for an alternative to its strained ties with the USSR. Today, Russia and China enjoy strong relations, and the US has little to offer Russia as an alternative. In the current geopolitical landscape, the United States has few realistic options to separate Russia from China. Economic incentives like lifting sanctions come with significant risks, and military or economic pressure might have the opposite effect, further strengthening the Russia-China alliance. Given these constraints, any major shift in Russia's foreign policy alignment remains highly unlikely.